Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the one television show by business, for business, about business. Recently, we had another Productivity Commission report talking about New Zealand's flatlining of productivity growth. And it just so happened, pretty much at the same time, I was having coffee with an old friend, Paul Goldsmith. And it turns out that Paul, of course, is front and central in this debate. Most recently, he's been made the opposition's lead person on finance, across the aisle from Grant Robertson, the Minister of Finance. But before we talk to Paul about his role as opposition spokesperson on finance, let's get to meet him and hear about his journey in getting there, and more importantly, about his very distinguished career in writing about business. So welcome to the Business at the Speed of Coffee, Paul.
Good to be here.
Now, Paul, you weren't always a politician, but you always were interested in writing. Now, tell me where it began with you as a writer.
Well, I did an MA in history at the University of Auckland, in New Zealand history. And funnily enough, my first taste of business history was a paper I did with Russell Stone, an old historian who's written quite a bit of business history in New Zealand. And through a bunch of uncoordinated events, I ended up writing a biography of John Banks as a politician back in 1996. So he was Minister of Tourism in the Bolger government.
So you weren't trained as a writer, you were more trained as an historian.
Yeah, well, historians write.
Yes.
And my thesis was on a kind of a biography, and so I got into biography. And that was my first introduction to politics. And from there, I started essentially working my way through the business round table and writing their histories, the histories of many of the people involved in that. And that sort of got me in that mix between politics and business and the New Zealand economy.
So, Masters of History sounds to me like you would have been a good student. Were you bright at school?
Oh yeah. Well. I mean, I was an enthusiastic student. I liked it all. I liked the sciences as much as the arts. But I was the youngest of three in the family, and my older brother had done medicine, and my sister had done law, and so I sort of felt obliged to strike off in my own direction. I ended up doing history, which is a bit reckless.
But you grew up in an environment where education was important.
Absolutely.
Auckland Grammar, am I right in saying?
Yeah. My father was a maths teacher there, and my mother was a nurse, so just a pretty bog standard New Zealand family, but with a very much an emphasis on education.
Now, and study sort of came naturally. I've got to ask you, was your household, let's say, a more conservative leaning household, or did you come from
Well, Mum was from a hardcore blue dairy farming stock and business stock, so very much so. Dad's family were a little bit more left-leaning, although he was reasonably solid, but not quite as hardcore as my mother.
So has your reading, and we're going to talk about some of the people you've written about in a minute, but has your reading reinforced those conservative kind of attitudes?
Well, a bit of a mix, actually. I mean, I've spent a lot of time doing work with Alan Gibbs, for example, and you wouldn't describe him as conservative. He's very free market, right wing.
He's libertarian,
sort of side of things. So socially liberal, fiscally and economically. Free market, so that end of the spectrum, and that was very much the flavour of a lot of the people that I dealt with. But the last book I did was on Bill Gallagher, the electric fence manufacturer, and he's fairly socially conservative, but also reasonably free market in his approach. So it was a mix of that spectrum, I suppose, which was a reflection of the National Party in the long term of a broad church between generally fiscally pretty conservative and reform.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of challenges here. We've got this issue with everybody obsessing about housing, which is driving. And we had Sam Stubbs from Simplicity on the show a while ago talking about the millions of dollars that are flowing back or available for the economy through KiwiSaver, which we didn't have 40 years ago. Sure. And yet the terrible lack of places to put it. We can't invest it in roads, for instance, because we don't have the devices. Would you, if in government,
the devices,
would you do something about giving him an opportunity to invest in New Zealand infrastructure?
Yeah, well, I think we, as a country, desperately need to continue to invest in infrastructure, and it doesn't all have to come out of the Crown balance sheet. We need to be innovative in the way that we do that, whether it's through PPPs or different mechanisms. There's different ways you can do it, but for a long time the country's been slow. I think in the last, again, national government, we really turned the dial up significantly in that space. If you think of the Waterview Tunnel here in Auckland, and the electrification of the rail and the roads of national significance, I think one of the Achilles heels for this government is the fact that they've basically stopped all the new stuff. But they haven't come up with anything else apart from the idea of the slow tram down Dominion Road at 4 billion or 6 billion or whatever it is, which is still on the drawing boards. And so that's the real sort of challenge with infrastructure, is the on again, off again approach, which is really damaging for the economy. And so if you want to build these things, you really have to have a long pipeline ahead of you. And we developed that. But then, of course, if you get Julian Genter coming in or Phil Twyford saying we've overinvested in roads and we've all got to get on our bikes, it makes it tricky. The message that this government's put up in many respects is, well, clear off if you're a foreigner, we don't want you, particularly if there's anything involved in land, and they're going to make it very difficult.
Or energy. I mean, look what happened to New Plymouth.
Well, precisely. There's only 2 countries in the world, as far as I can work out, who think that they're so rich.
They don't have to look for energy.
They don't need to look for oil and gas. It's us in France. There may be some other one. I haven't found them. So, that is a bizarre policy to take. And now, apparently, according to Eugenie Sage, we're so rich we don't need to look for gold as well. No. So, I think we need to recognise that any successful economy does lots of things. Even the most sophisticated modern economy in the world, the United States, it's still the largest producer of oil as well. I mean, you've got to do lots of things.
But there is an element of public relations here. I mean, let's face it, Eugenie Sage and her people have convinced a lot of New Zealanders that we shouldn't have genetic modification. That
it's starting to come
anyone
very
that digs a hole in the ground is going to ruin the planet. That anyone builds a road is, ruining future generations.
Dinosaur.
And yet, I would argue that there is a middle road, because most people that I know care about the environment deeply,
of course,
but they also want to actually have jobs for their kids. So
you've got to have a pragmatic sort of way through it, and so you do need access to natural resources. That's why we're not keen on the, I think, kind of very complacent and very short-sighted view that you can sort of just take this off the table. No, we don't want oil and gas. We don't like that. We don't look for gold. We're very sort of dubious about the dairy industry. We don't want foreign investors.
What do we like?
We don't really like international education because there's too many people coming in. The New Zealand First campaign to slash that. So you start taking all these things off the table, and then what are you left with?
Exactly.
We're going to have a hydrogen industry. Well, it might be interesting, but it might be interesting in 10 years' time. But what about now? And so that's where you've got to be careful. The other thing around productivity is that investment in infrastructure as well. It's important. I mean, I think in very simple terms, just think of the concrete mixer. If it's doing 5 trips a day, that might be fine. But if as a result of congestion and the lack of investment in our roads, it's only doing 2 trips, well, then you've got a problem, haven't you?
Exactly.
And we're going backwards, and we see that all the time. Where the regulatory side comes in, it's interesting. Again, I think we've got to ask some tough questions about regulations that have come in recently. Health and safety is one. The way that it's been interpreted, I think, has gone far too far.
Well, we actually, as near as I can tell, actually, for all of the angst and the incredible investment in it, we're replacing dangers in one place with another. People say, we can put scaffoldings up, and the people building the scaffoldings fall off them. So,
well, the main worry is where we've sort of found ourselves having 2 or sometimes 3 people doing the job that one person used to do, and no wonder we're having troubles with productivity. I saw a classic example yesterday when I was driving along, and you've got the little truck that sucks up the leaves on the side of the road.
Yes.
Got the flashing light, the little truck sort of going along, sucking along. Well, behind that truck with the flashing light sucking up the leaves was one of those massive motorway trucks with the flashing light. So suddenly you've got 2 people doing the job that one person used to do.
And 2 lots of machinery.
2 lots of machinery. So that You can't improve the productivity of the country if you're doing that, and you're making those decisions on a regular basis. So we actually, that's why regulation is so important.
As you know, that for many years I've been a great advocate to reform our planning systems.
Yes.
David Parker, I guess he's, what is he, Development Minister now? I can't remember, Minister of just about everything in the government. Environment has announced that they're going to look at it.
Yep. Not before time.
I think we'd all agree something has to be done. Are you aware of what shape that's going to take? Because I think that National would be there with them on some of this.
Well, it depends what they come up with, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, what they've fundamentally come up with is another working group, which is a particular problem with this country.
They're not very productive.
So it's gone to the big pile of working groups. Certainly, he's been making noises of the need to do something in the space, and there's even sort of mentioned the possibility of breaking out the planning side and the environmental side. Remember Geoffrey Palmer, when he started this ball rolling in the late 80s, said, well, we're going to lead the world, and we're going to put this two together, it's world leading, but nobody else followed. And so maybe after 30 years, maybe that's sending us a signal that it doesn't actually work all that effectively. And so we've got, there's no question that it's been a huge handbrake on the economic development.
I mean, I'm well on record, when Nick Smith was trying to do, I mean, I didn't feel that his tinkering, I knew why he...
Well, we never had the numbers.
He never had the numbers, and that was the reason.
So Peter Dunn, thank you very much. Never voted for it, and New Zealand First and Labour, despite all their talk, they never voted for reform. And so we
had a patch up which never was going to work. So back at first principles, what would you do?
Well, I mean, we're going through this process at the moment. Judith Collins, my colleague, is working on a new piece of legislation, and it's very much an open question as what's best to do, whether it's to separate it out and have a separate planning law, and one that, and then an environmental law with clear sort of things. If you can or you can't, requiring some clarity in that position.
I think everyone agrees that that's a good idea. I mean, we were talking about productivity before, and I'm wondering, it was all over the world news recently that the Minister of Finance had a wellness index. Now, let's say, okay, it's there and it has some merit. I'm not going to argue whether it's there or not. One would have thought that out of that idea would cascade some public policy initiatives which would support the idea of the wellness. Have you seen anything coming? And if you could, what would you envisage it might look like?
Yeah, well,
say you inherit the thing, what would you do with it?
Well, look, for a start, it's a conceit or, shocking arrogance to suggest that this is the first budget that's had well-being at its heart. I mean, every single budget in the history of New Zealand, I think, has been focused on the well-being of New Zealanders. How sort of arrogant to suggest that this is something new. I mean, why do we want to grow the economy? Well, because
so people are better off.
Fundamentally, so that that's right. People, to enable New Zealanders to do the sorts of things that they need to do, which is care for themselves and their families, have
education, get well at hospitals,
and satisfying work, and to be able to contribute. That's what it's all about. So there's a long economic tradition around sort of well-being theories and things like that, and I'm not sort of antagonistic to that. What worries me, though, is that if in the wrong hands, it can be a smokescreen, effectively, to hide poor performance around the core. Because it doesn't make, just having a focus on the, the number of friends people have and whether they've got pets and whether they do yoga and all, is no substitute for the realities of, can we afford the latest cancer drugs? Well, we can only afford it if we've got the money. And I hear every sort of week on the radio somebody saying, well, we're not getting the stuff that the Australians are getting, why aren't we getting it? Well, there's just a very simple answer to that primarily.
They've got more money.
They got more money. They've got a much stronger economy. And that's why it's important to build on that. So, a lot of fluff, not much detail. The other side of it, of course, is the quality of the spending and the rigour around what we're getting for it. And that sort of worries us a little bit. And then the $3 billion Provincial Growth Fund. You spend $3 billion, you're going to buy some useful things, but you're also going to waste a lot if you're just chucking it out the door. So, we set 1 or 2 parts economic development, 8 or 9 parts New Zealand first re-election front, and it's not very good use. And when you look at how are they actually going to measure the success of that $3 billion spending, the only current plan right now is, and you wouldn't believe it, but it's true, is to spend the $3 billion
and see what happens.
And do a quick study at the end to see whether they got any value for it or not. Well, heck, that's not taking care of people's money, because if you think again of some of those details, $500 million to the 1 billion trees. Well, okay, so what are we getting for this? Well, $500 million, and they say, well, we're going to create 1,000 jobs. Well, hang on a moment. So
400 are on the terrace, aren't they?
Well, 2/3 of the jobs. 2/3 of the trees, sorry, are meant to be native trees. So if you're converting, you're converting sheep and beef land that's producing stuff that we're selling to the world and creating jobs. You're converting that to native forestry. Well, you're destroying jobs. Once you planted them, there's nothing. So you're taking productive land, destroying jobs, putting it into native forestry, spending $500 million to do it. And then, even to plant those trees, one-off trees, you're going to bring people in from Melanesia on the REC scheme, because all the NEFs are on the couch because you've changed the welfare rules, which doesn't encourage people, doesn't say you have to work anymore. So, the whole thing is a very confused area of public policy that makes no sense whatsoever.
But votes in the regions.
Well, it's not flowing through to support for New Zealand First yet. People see it for what it is. One of the things that I think got a lot of resonance in the last elections was the general concern that there were many people being left behind in New Zealand. And there were plenty of pictures of people sleeping under bridges and so on. And the number of homeless has gone up, of course. Well, the stats haven't changed much, have they, since then? Hardship grants up 70%. 70%. 500,000 hardship grants was the latest stat. And the main driver of that, of course, is the cost of rent. And why have rents gone up? Well, let's think about it for a moment. It's not, it's not compulsory to rent out your house. So people are taking them off the market because of all the problems with the regulation. If you add substantial costs, and there's been one thing after another, and you take away the potential capital gain through 5 years, and all the changes, there's been one thing after another. And the logical outcome of that is that a number of people will say, well, this is all... I'm out of here. I can't be bothered with this. That might be great for a first home buyer to buy it, but it's which is a couple going into a house that might have been rented out to 5. Anyway, but the short-term impact, it'll sort itself out in 5 or 10 years, but the short-term impact is that there's fewer houses to rent. But if you're a punter out here, the price goes up, and it's gone up 50% on it. I think everyone sees that, but it's a direct consequence of the government policy. That's the point. But now you're fast forward a little while. You're on the Treasury benches. Yep. You're faced with the same problem. What are you going to do about it? I mean, because it is a tractable problem. There are not enough houses. Too many people need accommodation. Well, the overriding priority, of course, is to focus absolutely on reducing the price of new housing. New housing. Because you don't do anything about the existing housing. Well, that's to expand the total supply, and that takes you to RMA reform, obviously. But it's broader than that. It's also investment around competition policy and ensuring we can deal with all those costs which are very high in New Zealand. That's around skills training. There's no one thing. I mean, well, you wrote a book about Fletchers. Yeah. And I mean, in fairness, I don't want to ping them particularly, but there's no doubt they've done very well out of the supply chain in New Zealand. Yeah, well, one of the challenges of being a small, isolated country is that we don't have as much competition in so many parts of the economy, so the best thing that any government can do, I think, is absolutely rigorously keep hunting out and removing barriers to new entrants coming into the market. I think most people agree with that. And the extent to which New Zealanders can get access to the globally best price for anything is a major advance. So that's why the digital sort of sales boom is a great thing. It's challenging for local retailers, but fundamentally it's a great thing for New Zealand consumers to get real competition in. as long as it's, and that's why you've got to sort of work your way through all those GST issues. But still, fundamentally, we need to expand competition and remove those barriers. And I fundamentally think we've got to keep pushing hard and things like standards and so forth. There's nothing unique about New Zealand's weather. Nothing. It rains, it blows, they have earthquakes all around the world. A window.
It's a window.
A window's a window. If it's fine in the US, it should be fine here. We shouldn't have all these complications. And we've got to keep rigorously pushing away at all that stuff.
So, I mean, that leads us, of course, to the fact that we do have an unbelievable amount of regulation. So regulatory reform is the answer. And we have tolerated monopolies for a long time, which brings me to monopolies of the unions. You haven't talked at all about industrial relations reform.
I'm happy to get onto the topic. It's a bad one. What's been proposed in many areas, particularly with the fair pay agreements, is a real reversion back to a failed policy of the past, which is effectively national awards. And anybody who thinks that's the way to have a flexible and responsive workforce has got rocks in their heads.
And you've obviously gone around talking to business. Is that a theme that's coming through?
They're terrified by it. Well, I mean, that's just conscious. I mean, you wonder why business confidence has fallen so much, and it is a real drag on the New Zealand economy. I think there are three elements to it. One is costs being piled onto business. Yeah. And, frankly, the minimum wage going up 27% in 3 years is a pretty big cost. Everybody wants wages to go up, but it's fundamentally got to be based on productivity or value, or fundamentally.
Speaking of wages, we've just paid nurses and teachers, and now is it kindergarten teachers as well?
Yep.
Quite a substantial increase.
So the genie's out of the bottle on that.
I would have thought so. That will telegraph through into other areas. And one presumes local body wages, also all this living wage thing.
Yep. So costs are going up big time. Then there's the uncertainty factor, which is huge. So the biggest one, of course, was capital gains tax for 18 months. I mean, who would invest? What logical person would make a major investment if you're not sure if you're going to have to pay a capital gains tax on it? The best thing is to keep your hands in your pockets and wait it out.
Yeah.
And if enough people do that, then the economy slows. Now we've got 300 working groups or whatever. They've tossed everything up into the air. Again, the logical response is to wait to see what happens. So you've got costs going up, uncertainty, and then the government demonstrating incompetence, as they have with Kiwi Build and many other things. And transport policy is another one where you stopped a whole lot of things, haven't started anything new. So when you put all those three things together, business confidence is falling, and a big part of that uncertainty is around that industrial relations space and the costs being added on. So uncertainty around whether they'll go, how far they'll go with fair pay agreements, and the cost is just an unending list of things that have been changed. It's little small changes, but collectively add up to something quite substantial when it comes to various.
Parking the political agenda, which I know you guys have got a lot of work to do in the next few months to maybe even find a coalition partner, whatever you do. But take that aside, as citizen Paul, how do you feel about New Zealand's economic future?
I think we should. We've got a bright future in this country. I think fundamentally.
You've got 4 kids coming into it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the rest of the world wants our stuff. The challenge that we have is the same we've always had, which is to be internationally competitive. Nobody owes us a living. Nobody gives a stuff about a little place down the end of the world. We've got to deliver value and deliver things that they want in order to pay our way. And so we can't be we've got to be realistic about that. And I think we've got good stuff to sell. And so our terms of trade at the moment are very high. We should be booming, and I think we made good progress under the previous government. And what worries me, I think, is just the extent to which those gains are being put at risk by well-meaning, but I think naive and complacent economic policies from this government.
Yeah. So I mean,
I think fundamentally we still, the country still could.
We've got a good country basically with lots of sound prospects, which we could easily mess up by taking poor choices.
Yeah. It's not just the economy, of course, that makes us a great country, and that's the thing we never lose sight of, in the sense that I see politics about trying to deliver a stronger economy so you can do all these things, but also preserving and enhancing what's special about this country, which is the quality of our environment, our rule of law, high trust, relatively low corruption, social high levels of social cohesion,
and I would
all those
argue
things are
our
very
civics
important.
is good. I mean, in spite of you guys, and well, we see you jousting in the house, but
we're not too bad.
Yeah, but I think there's I see you also having a drink with your mates at the Koru Club and so on. There is a sense of civility about our public discourse, which we don't see in England and the US particularly.
Well, Jones called me Goldfinger. That's about as bad as it got.
Well, there's an underlying charm to the humour that sits there,
it should be an advantage in a small society such as ours that we can wear appropriate reach across the aisle and be able to sort of get into the same room.
In terms of your own personal political style, you make yourself available to businesses in the community?
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's very much a New Zealand thing, isn't it?
Oh, well, I mean, none of us has a monopoly on wisdom, and one of the great joys of political life, and what I enjoy so much about it, is the fact that it forces you to engage with people doing fundamentally different things every day and living. You can easily sort of just get trapped in your own little silo, but in politics you can't. I mean, you're constantly forced to meet with people from all over the country, every far-flung region, and there's wonderful things going on and wonderful people living interesting lives in all the sorts of nooks and crannies around the back and beyond that you visit, and so that makes life fascinating, and so. It fills you with optimism because Kiwis are innovative, smart, honest people more often than not, and that makes.
We're doing this show maybe 18 months out from an election.
Yeah.
Now we're going to play a little game here. Maybe I'll talk to you a little bit closer to the election, but what do you give yourselves? What kind of chance do you give yourselves in the coming elections against what has been a pretty popular government? And a coalition which, much to everybody's surprise, is hung together like glue.
So far, I think we're definitely still in the game. I mean, if we go back to it, I came in 2011 at the end of the first term of the national government, when John Key was bestriding the nation like a colossus, hugely popular, right up in the polls, and we got back by one seat. MMP elections are always tight.
Yes.
And it'll be tight in next year. And
is it possible you could get in there without a coalition partner?
Well, I mean, all we can do is maximise our vote and keep the pressure on the government. And with each passing month in the year of delivery, and in the absence of any delivery on a whole lot of measures, the pressure builds.
Yeah.
And if they'll have Labor will have two coalition partners who, in every poll have been close to or below the threshold, and as you get closer to the election, the pressure mounts.
It gets more difficult.
It's like playing tennis. You just got to keep returning the ball, keep the pressure on, and eventually people start to crack.
I'm with you. Before we close the show, in summary, Paul, you've given us a good roundup of what's happening with the economy. I see a sense of optimism for the future, both of yourself and the National Party. I have to say that we wish you all the best. There is a whole lot of work that has to be done, and I suspect that you're fiscal responsibly looking forward to a growing, engaged, and, shall we say, innovative future. So thank you for being on Business at the Speed of Coffee.
Great to talk to you, and I hope to be back sometime soon.